All right, so we're going to start with external respiration. So this is the air in the alveolus that has a lot of oxygen in it. This is the blood in the capillary that has our erythrocyte. In the erythrocyte, we have our hemoglobin, we have some water, and in the plasma, we have some chloride. This is our respiratory barrier with our surfactant, the alveolar epithelium, our fused basement membrane here, and then the endothelium of our capillary. So remember that with external respiration, what we're going to see with regards to oxygen only, because that's what we're going to focus on right now, is that because there's more oxygen in the air and less oxygen in the blood, oxygen is going to diffuse across our barrier here into our blood. And so remember that some of that oxygen is just going to come in and be dissolved in the plasma. Most of the oxygen, so remember 98.5% of it comes in to our erythrocyte. And once it's in the erythrocyte, remember that it's going to attach to hemoglobin to form our oxyhemoglobin. So the two ways that we are transporting oxygen are going to be 1.5% of the oxygen dissolved in the plasma. 98.5% of the oxygen is going to be attached to hemoglobin in the form of oxyhemoglobin. So this is the oxygenated blood that is now going to go back to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary veins. And from the left side of the heart, it's going to go out into the systemic circuit. So let's see what happens as it now goes out into the systemic circuit. So, now we're out in the systemic circuit. So these are some cells in one of my body tissues. So maybe these are muscle cells, maybe they're neurons, maybe they're just some connective tissue cells. Who knows, right? So these are cells out in our body. They have interstitial fluid around them. And right now we're looking just at oxygen levels. So you'll notice that while there is oxygen in the blood, dissolved in the plasma and as oxyhemoglobin, there is no oxygen in our interstitial fluid. So we have a concentration gradient in place. More oxygen in the blood, less oxygen in the interstitial fluid. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our oxygen diffuse across the wall of the capillary, which is the endothelium and its basement membrane, in order to go from where there's more of it to where there's less of it. So our dissolved oxygen is just going to diffuse into our tissues so that the cells can start to use it. With our oxyhemoglobin, what's going to happen is that the bond between the hemoglobin and oxygen is going to break. And we talked in class about what are some things that cause that, like temperature changes, pH changes, the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the environment. Once that oxygen separates from the hemoglobin, the oxygen is then going to be able to diffuse across the capillary wall and get into our tissues. So now we've delivered the oxygen to our tissues. We picked it up at the lung level with external respiration, and we dropped it off at the tissues with our internal respiration. So now what we're going to do is once we unload the oxygen, we're now going to pick up carbon dioxide to transport it back to the lungs so we can get rid of it. So lots of carbon dioxide in the tissues because as the cells are using the oxygen, carbon dioxide is being produced. We've got lots of carbon dioxide here. We don't have any carbon dioxide in the blood. So our carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the tissues across the capillary wall into the blood. So 7% of that carbon dioxide is going to stay dissolved in the plasma. 23% of it is going to come into our erythrocyte and attach to hemoglobin to form carboaminohemoglobin. But remember that most of our carbon dioxide, 70% of it, is going to go through a much more complex process. So remember that that other 70% of the carbon dioxide comes into the erythrocyte, where it now reacts with the water. And when water and carbon dioxide react with each other, they are now going to produce something called H2CO3. That's our carbonic acid. The H2 from the water, C from the carbon dioxide, 2 of the O's from the carbon dioxide, and the other O from the water, right? So we've got our carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid almost immediately then splits into 2 things. Remember that a hydrogen breaks off, and then we're left with HCO3 minus. So we started out with H2CO3. We're now left with an H plus, a hydrogen ion, and HCO3 minus, which is a bicarbonate ion. If we allow the hydrogen ions to just stay by themselves and not bind them up, they're going to change the pH of the blood very quickly. So as many of those free hydrogens as we can, we are going to have those attached to whatever hemoglobin is sitting around. Because remember, we used a lot more hemoglobin to transport the oxygen because 98.5% of the oxygen was attached to hemoglobin. But we only have 23% of the carbon dioxide attached to hemoglobin as carboaminohemoglobin. So we have lots of extra hemoglobin sitting around. Hydrogen attaches to that to bind it up, and then we're left with the bicarbonate ion. And what's going to happen is the bicarbonate ion is going to leave the erythrocyte, and it takes its negative charge with it. When a negative charge leaves the cell, we're going to have to replace it with another negative charge. Otherwise, we're going to affect the charge of the cell overall, and the cell's not going to work properly. So when our negatively charged bicarbonate ion leaves the erythrocyte, that's where the chloride shift occurs, and now the chloride moves into our erythrocyte. So we now have 3 ways that we are transporting carbon dioxide. 7% is dissolved in the plasma, 23% in the form of carboaminohemoglobin, and 70%, so most of it, being transported as these bicarbonate ions in the plasma. So we're now going to transport this carbon dioxide-rich blood back to the right side of the heart through systemic veins, and then from the right side of the heart, this blood is now going to go to the pulmonary circuit. So let's move all this back up to our pulmonary circuit here. So with our pulmonary circuit now, again, we've got our blood where we've transported our carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate ions, dissolved in the plasma, and as carboaminohemoglobin. In the air in the alveolus, there is very little carbon dioxide, so I now have more carbon dioxide in the blood, less carbon dioxide in the air, so the carbon dioxide is going to want to diffuse from where there's more of it to where there's less of it. So our dissolved carbon dioxide is going to very easily just diffuse across our respiratory barrier into the air. Our carboaminohemoglobin, we're going to see that the bond between the hemoglobin and the carbon dioxide separates. The carbon dioxide can then diffuse out of the blood into the air, and that hemoglobin is now available to pick up oxygen that would be coming in, like we saw earlier. Then what's going to happen with our bicarbonate ions is that they are now going to move back into the erythrocyte. And when they move back in, the chloride has to move back out. We're also going to see that our hemoglobin with the hydrogen attached is going to break the bond between the hemoglobin and hydrogen. So this hydrogen is now free, and we now have more hemoglobin to attach oxygen to. Our hydrogen and our bicarbonate ion are going to undergo a chemical reaction, and when they undergo a chemical reaction, The hydrogen and the bicarbonate ion are going to attach to each other, and we're now going to have our carbonic acid. Our carbonic acid immediately splits into water and carbon dioxide. The water is going to stay in the erythrocyte. The carbon dioxide diffuses out. So you'll notice that in the blood, we are right back to where we started. So this would now be available to pick up oxygen coming in, right? So what you should have noticed is that the reactions that occurred at one end of this process were just the opposite of the reactions that occurred at the other end of our process, okay? So I hope that clears it up for you. As always, feel free to email me any questions that you might have about this.